From the News Channel 5 Network, this is SportsLine.
And there's SportsLine on your television. Steve Layman here with you. Glad you are here with us on News Channel 5. Plus, the Predators season over, swept at the hands of the Colorado Avalanche in the first round of the Stanley Cup playoffs. And this was not a close series. Colorado scored 5 goals in the first 15 minutes and 4 seconds of game number 1. Of course, UC Saros unable to play because of a high ankle sprain. David Riddick got the start in game 1, and it did not go well. The Preds ended up losing that game by a final of 7-2. In game 2, Connor Ingram, who made his first career playoff start, nearly stole one for the Preds. He stopped 49 consecutive shots, but the 50th shot went in from Cale Makar about 8 minutes into overtime, and Colorado took a 2-0 series lead on their home ice. The Predators played much better in game 3, and then even more, I was about to say more better, then even better in game 4 against the Avalanche, but they just could not get over the hump. Colorado with 4 power play goals in game number 3. They had 7 total goals for the second time in the first 3 games in the series. And then last night, the Preds finally got a lead for the first time in the entire series with 16:02 to play in the third period. Philip Forsberg got his first goal of the series, and they were just unable to hold on. Colorado scored 3 times in the final 11:05. Devontae's with 1 goal. Then they got one from Valeri Nichushkin, and it was capped off by Nathan McKinnon, who wraps up with his 5th goal of a series that Colorado absolutely dominated. 21-9 in total goals. And think about this for a second. The total time led in the series in 4 games, which amounts to be, including the overtime, roughly 248 total minutes played. Colorado led for just shy of 139 of those minutes. The Predators led for 4 minutes and 57 seconds last night. That was the chasm in this series between a team that many people think could win the Stanley Cup and where the Predators are right now. And that is a reality that they have to face going into the offseason. And it's going to be, I think, a challenging offseason because the Predators have kind of stagnated. I wouldn't say that they're regressing. They've brought in new guys. They went from being one of the oldest teams in the league to one of the youngest teams in the league now. And so there are some growing pains that come along with that. But under the early years of Peter Laviolette in 2014 and 15 and 16 and certainly into 17 and 18, when they had sort of the glory days, so to speak, that team always felt like it was getting better right up to the end in 2018. And even when that team lost in Game 7 of the second round, you felt like, okay, this team won the President's Trophy this year. Didn't go their way in the playoffs, but sometimes that happens, and they were playing a great team in Winnipeg who had the second best record that year, just behind the Predators, and it was unfortunate to have to meet them that early in the playoffs. But I think the belief in the building at that time was, well, you just run it back with this crew because we believe that they can get it done. In 2019, they did win the division, but it was clearly not the same team. They didn't have the same juice in the regular season. They lost in the first round as a heavily favored team against the Stars in just 6 games in round 1. And that's when the real breakdown of the roster came. That's when they had to start making the moves to break some things up, because it was clear that what was happening there wasn't good enough. And so they made that transition from being an old team to a younger team, trying to get some of these young guys up to speed at the NHL level. But there came a coaching change in 2020 from Peter Laviolette to John Hines. They go into the bubble. They lose a series they shouldn't lose to Arizona. They come out of that. Last year, they battled their way in a tough division the way it was realigned for COVID. And they battled tooth and nail against Carolina in the postseason. felt like things were going in the right direction. This year they came out like gangbusters, but they couldn't sustain it in the second half of the season. And they never got anything going in this series. And so now you have to ask the question, where do they stand? When they come back next season, and they've got questions about free agents, and they've got a lot of cap room, so they can bring in some new guys. The big decision, obviously, is Philip Forsberg. But there's also a decision about Hines as well. What do you do with this Predators team after they didn't win a single game in the postseason? Because right now it feels like, okay, maybe they're good enough to keep getting to the playoffs. But once they get there, they don't feel like a threat at the moment. And that is the frustrating thing, because if the Stanley Cup playoffs are known for one thing, it's the idea that anything can happen. That if you get in, the playoffs are so hotly contested from the 1 seed to the 8 seed in both conferences that if you get the hot goaltender, if you play well, if you stay healthy, legitimately anything can happen. The best run the Predators ever made in the playoffs, they were the 8 seed. But they swept the 1 seed in round 1. They moved past another really good team in the Blues in round 2. Right now, it doesn't feel like the Predators could do that. The serious discussion about this series was, could they win a game? Could they get it to game 5? And yes, I know UC Saros wasn't there. Maybe he steals you a game. Maybe. But the way these two teams played, I'm talking the totality of the teams on the ice, it was just clear that Colorado was better, and it wasn't close. And even Roman Josi and Matthias Ekholm kind of admitted as much last night, talking about the disappointment of being swept. But as they move forward, this is a club right now that has to figure out how to close that gap. Because right now the gap of the top teams in the NHL is sizable to where the Predators are. And it's a mission for this ownership group. It's a mission for General Manager David Poile, John Hines, all of these players to try to figure that out. How do they shorten that gap? Because you want to keep getting there. And Ekholm said this. He said, look, I've been fortunate to play here for really 10 years. We've been in the playoffs pretty much every year, certainly in my later stages of that run. It's been 8 consecutive years that the Preds have been in the playoffs. I've made a couple runs, but you just don't know how many times you're going to get back. And the ultimate goal for every player in the NHL is to get to the Stanley Cup final and win it, to win that cup, to finally get your hands on the most prized possession in all of sports and hoist it as a champion. It is the most prized possession in sports, and every player wants it. And for a guy like Ekholm, you look at what's out there in front of you. How do the Preds get back to that 2017 level? And that is what they're going to have to spend this summer thinking long and hard about. And again, there are some other factors here. You had the coaching change in 2020. Then you had the shutdown for COVID. They move into a bubble for the postseason. That was all weird. Last year, it wasn't a normal regular season in terms of its length. This year was finally something closer to a normal season. Now, the schedule was a little wonky because they were planning on taking a full month off for the Olympic break. Then they pulled out of the Olympics and they kind of reworked the schedule. But it went later into the year than it normally would have. I mean, we'd be second going into the 3rd round right now in mid-May if the schedule was in a normal year. So they get back to that next year, and I think that will be beneficial for everybody in hockey. But certainly the problems don't go to that. You can't blame COVID. You can't blame the schedule because everybody else in the league had to deal with those too. So will it be nice to get out of that next year? Yes. But you can't sit here and say that's the reason why the Predators haven't won a series since 2018. You can't sit here and say that's the reason they couldn't beat Colorado once in this series. And they make the dubious distinction of being the first team in franchise history to get swept. Those are the things that they're going to have to figure out moving forward. Our phone lines are open, 737-7767, the number. We'll take our first break. If you want to chime in on the conversation, we'll get to that. We'll also hear from some of the key players and head coach John Hines as well as we move along here on a Tuesday night on SportsLine on News Channel 5+.